Hi everyone, welcome to Uncanny Mystery. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, let me know in the comments. Where are you from and what time is it as you're watching? Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The Hitchhiker. I was driving home late one night on a deserted highway. Rain was coming down in sheets and visibility was near zero. I almost missed him, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, especially at night, but something about this guy made me uneasy. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark raincoat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. I pulled over, and he slid into the passenger seat without a word. The car was silent except for the drumming of the rain and the hum of the engine. I glanced over at him, but his face was still hidden in the shadows of his hat. After a few miles, I tried to make conversation. "Going far?" I asked. He didn't answer. I tried again. Rough night out there. Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine. The silence was unnerving. I decided to focus on the road, trying to ignore the presence beside me. Then I noticed something strange. The road ahead seemed to be disappearing. The lines on the asphalt faded away, and the trees on either side of the road grew denser, darker. I checked my rear-view mirror. The road behind me was gone too. We were surrounded by an impenetrable forest. Panic started to set in. I slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving as if on its own. I looked at the hitchhiker. He was still staring straight ahead, his hat still hiding his face. Then he slowly turned his head towards me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. He raised a hand, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of touching me, he pointed to something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a faint light flickering through the trees. He nodded, then opened the car door and stepped out into the darkness. Just like that, he was gone. I was alone again, surrounded by the silent forest. Then, as quickly as it had disappeared, the road reappeared. I cautiously drove forward, following the light. It led me to a small, abandoned gas station. I pulled up, shaken but relieved. I never saw the hitchhiker again, but I'll never forget the night he led me through the darkness. Story 2. The Mysterious Passenger. This happened a few months ago. I've been driving for a ride-sharing service for a few years, usually sticking to late-night shifts. The roads are quieter and the tips are better, but there's a trade-off. Every once in a while, you get a story that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I'd always thought of myself as careful, having dealt with my share of odd passengers, but nothing came close to what I'm about to tell you. I didn't have a dash cam at the time, and that night was the main reason I installed one. It started off normal enough. Sometime after 2 a.m., I got a request from a nearby convenience store. It seemed harmless at first, but I got a weird feeling in my gut. The store was closed, all the lights were off, and there wasn't a single car in the lot. As I pulled closer, I saw him. He was pacing outside the store, wearing a ratty hoodie with a hole in the sleeve. His movements were jerky, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. I should have just canceled the ride, but I unlocked the doors, and he slid into the back seat without a word. I regretted my decision immediately. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio, but he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was deep and raspy. We drove in silence for a while. Then he asked me if I ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. He started talking about how he used to be a rideshare driver and quit because some punk stole stuff from his car. He was slurring his words, and he was smiling the whole time, which was incredibly unsettling. He concluded his story by saying, "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That comment did it for me. I started thinking of him as more of a threat. He kept babbling about nonsense, some of it concerning, some of it gibberish. Eventually, he started apologizing to someone, saying he had just done something awful and that he was a bad person. We were only a few minutes from the stop when he yelled at me that I had missed a turn. I slammed on the brakes. Headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. The guy in my back seat slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. He told me I had gotten lucky, opened my car door, and disappeared. I called my shift short after that. A few weeks later, I came across a news article about a convenience store robbery that night, 2 blocks from where I had picked up that guy. It makes me sick knowing I was inches away from a dangerous criminal. I'm a little scared to contact the police. I'm much more cautious about who I let in my car now. Story 3. The Cabin in the Woods. I used to live in the city, but after a traumatic experience, I developed phonophobia. About 3 years ago, I found a cabin in Oregon. It seemed perfect. Few neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service, and most importantly, no noise. The cabin was small but cozy. The nearest neighbor, Michelle, lived about a 10-minute walk down a dirt path. A week after I moved in, Michelle came by with a basket of preserves. She was an older woman with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes. She welcomed me to the woods and said, "Always keep your lanterns full. Your windows shut tight, and your wit's sharper than your axe." It sounded more like a warning than advice. There was a thunderstorm that night. A few hours after it started, there was a knock at the door. It was Michelle, soaked to the bone. She said she saw someone near my woodpile and that I should know about it. I looked through the rain but couldn't see anything. She told me to be careful and walked away. Her story was suspicious. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 10 minutes away? I locked up the cabin and listened to the storm. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping outside my window. I saw Michelle standing at the edge of the woods, her body angled away from my house. I didn't sleep for hours. Then, there was a quiet knock at the door. I looked through the pane and saw a burly-looking bald guy with a thick beard. I retreated to my bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. I heard banging on the front door, like someone was smashing it with a heavy object. The front door gave way, and I heard glass breaking and with splintering. The smashing stopped, and I was in complete silence. The police arrived quickly, but the man was gone. They did a pathetic search, and wouldn't even search the woods. They told me that living in the woods was a risk I was taking. They accompanied me to Michelle's house, and my jaw dropped. The entire cabin was abandoned. No one had lived there in decades. I moved out of the cabin, but not before spending one more night there. Some of my friends think Michelle was a spirit trying to protect me. I think it's more likely that she and that man were squatting in the abandoned cabin. I just don't understand why they targeted me, or why Michelle would warn me if she planned on breaking into my house. Story 4. The Shadow in the Static. The old radio crackled to life, a low hum filling the dusty attic. I'd inherited it from my grandfather, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. He'd always warned me to stay away from the attic, but curiosity, that insatiable human flaw, had finally gotten the better of me. I'd been searching for something, anything, that might shed light on his secretive life. The radio's dial was stuck on a frequency far beyond the usual broadcast range. As I reached out to adjust it, a voice, raspy and distorted, filled the room. It wasn't music nor a human language I recognized. It was a chaotic jumble of sounds, whispers, clicks, and static, like 1,000 voices trying to speak at once. I recoiled, my heart pounding. This wasn't just a broken radio. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the radio. I couldn't stay away from the attic. The voice, or whatever it was, seemed to be calling to me. Sometimes, amidst the cacophony, I'd hear a word or phrase, something almost recognizable, like a memory flickering at the edge of consciousness. It was always something dark, something unsettling. Lost, it would whisper. Hungry, coming, sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. The static seeped into my dreams, filling them with shadowy figures and whispers that promised pain. I started to see things in the corners of my eyes, fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows that danced just beyond my perception. I felt a constant gnawing dread, a feeling that something was watching me, waiting. One night, I was in the attic, listening to the radio. The static was louder than usual, more intense. Suddenly, the voice became clearer. It spoke my name. Sarah, it hissed, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old boxes. As they tumbled to the floor, I saw something glinting in the dim light. It was a photograph. It was a picture of my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing in front of the radio. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was a figure, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. I recognized the figure. It was the same shadow I'd been seeing in my dreams, the same shadow that danced at the edge of my vision. As I stared at the photo, the radio's static intensified. The voice spoke again, louder this time, closer. "We're here, Sarah." The shadows in the attic seemed to deepen, to coalesce. I could feel a coldness in the air, a presence that was both ancient and malevolent. I knew then what my grandfather had been hiding. He hadn't just owned an old radio. He'd opened a door, a gateway to something dark, something that had been waiting for generations. And now, it was here for me. The shadow in the static had finally found its way out. Story 5. The Echo in the Well. The old well in my backyard had always been a source of fascination and fear. Locals whispered stories about it, tales of a dark presence that dwelled within its depths. They said that if you listened closely, you could hear whispers echoing from the bottom, voices of those who had met their end in the well's cold embrace. I, of course, dismissed these stories as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations. But there was something about the well, a sense of unease, that made me avoid it. One sweltering summer day, however, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate the well, to see if there was any truth to the local legends. I approached the well cautiously, peering into its dark depths. The air around it was noticeably colder, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. I could hear a faint echo, a sound that seemed to be coming from far below. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the sound. It was a whisper, faint and distorted, but I could make out a word. Help. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks on my ears. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. Help me. I felt a pull, a compulsion to look deeper into the well. As I leaned closer, I saw something moving in the darkness. It was a shape, indistinct and shadowy, but it was definitely moving. Fear gripped me. I stumbled back from the well, my heart pounding. I didn't understand what I had seen, but I knew it was something evil. I ran back to the house, locking the doors and windows. I tried to forget what I had heard and seen, but the whispers kept echoing in my mind. That night, I had a dream. I was standing at the edge of the well, looking down into its depths. The shadowy figure was there, reaching out to me. It spoke. Its voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, chilling command. "Join us." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. I knew then that the stories were true. There was something in the well, something that wanted to be found. I never went near the well again, but I could still hear the whispers, calling to me in the silence of the night. They're still there waiting. These are just a few examples. The possibilities for horror stories are endless. The key is to tap into primal fears. The fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being alone. Use vivid imagery, create suspense, and leave the reader with a lingering sense of unease. Most importantly, make the horror personal. Make it something that the reader can relate to, something that can happen to them. Story 6. Petrified. You would never have noticed it if you weren't looking for it. That was precisely the point. The instructions given in my embroidery group had been clear enough. After nightfall, take a stroll on the second lane past the bakery. Look for the unlit lamppost and turn down that dark alley, they said in hushed voices, as the pianist began playing in sudden loud fervor by coincidence. Then you will see a mossy stone staircase, which you will descend, and at the end of it there is a dim hallway. She lives through the set of green doors on the left. The doors are tall and French like my husband's mistress, but peeling and weathered. I can tell they were once painted a lovely shade of emerald green. Half of that green paint lies in small piles of flakes on the cobblestone. I debate knocking, and decide instead to reach with false confidence for the rusted copper handle. It turns downward easily. A small bell rings and echoes. Welcome. On the poster, she is grotesque, an example of how time and sin turn a person sour. But in person, she is the kind of enduring beauty you can't tear your eyes away from. Do come in, darling. Don't be shy. Contrary to popular belief, I don't bite, although I can't say nothing here does. Her voice is like a wind chime, melodic and resonating, barely brushing over the crashing waves of her words. I wonder if I'm here too long if that voice will drag me out to deep sea. Or did that only work on men in the myths? Take a seat, love. Yes, there is perfect. Would you like a cup of tea? Well, it's never too late for tea, is it now? I enjoy it late into the night myself. But maybe you've been raised more proper than that. Here, the cup is warm, not hot. If she noticed my shaking hands when reaching for it, she didn't say a word. It takes more than a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the warmly lit room after a dark and shadowy street. Among her many talents, it cannot be said that she was a good decorator. The shabby boards of the walls are empty, but for an assortment of faded newspaper clippings from the highlights of her anonymous career. Obituaries, mostly. A tattered blue curtain with tassels hangs behind the armchair she's perched in, dividing off part of the room. Eccentrically painted shelves house arrays of books and bottles of objects my gaze prefers not to settle on. She would have been called a witch for her collections had she not already acquired numerous more colorful nicknames by the public. The only item of some value is worn loosely around her slender wrist, a heavy and ornate gold watch. The kind of thing that would make a petty thief's day to see glinting underneath a man's sleeve in the street. She catches me admiring it and smiles thinly, holding up her arm up to eye level. Isn't it a beauty? It was my first husband's, this watch. On the 10th anniversary of his death, I'm going to smash it to bits and melt the gold into a necklace for myself. I deserve a little gift from him, I think. Her laugh unnerves me, but I find myself too curious to be afraid. I politely say my condolences for her husband's death. Oh, darling, don't be sorry that that man is dead. The one good thing he did was to be the inspiration for the charity work I do. I haven't always done this. I used to be an actress, a leading lady of the stage. Men would come from all over the city to see my shows, for I was beautiful then. Sometimes after the shows, they would approach me, usually blind drunk, complimenting my dress or what was underneath it, asking for a kiss or a drink or a night. And sometimes they didn't ask. My husband became my husband not because he asked, but because he damaged me. And he was rich enough to get away with it and clever enough to know that marriage was my only option. She smooths down the skirt of her maroon dress, then looks up at me with a solemn expression I can't fully read. It isn't hard to believe she was once a sought-after woman, though sunken in age. Her cheeks are smooth and her face looks as though it was hand-carved out of porcelain by God. Her hair is twisted into a dark crown atop her head, secured with metallic pins. Her eyes are like a cat's, but not a house cat. No, definitely not. Like those of a tiger that has been left to go hungry for far too long. I will her to continue talking and not look at me with those eyes again. We sip our tea in unison, upholding our masquerade as ladies. She takes in a breath. He said he loved me, and at the beginning I believed it. He may have loved me. He certainly desired me. I think mostly he loved seeing the desire and jealousy of other men when he told them I was his wife. But that got old fast. So did I, in his eyes. When it had been a year and I still had not given him a child, I turned ugly to him and he acted ugly accordingly. One night, he came home from the pub talking about how the other men's wives had filled their houses with children by now. He spoke of babies like cattle. Then he threatened that he ought to tell the whole town that I was secretly a whore and leave me. I should have kept quiet and obeyed and smothered him in his sleep, like a good wife. Instead, I promised him that as long as I was alive, I would never let a child be born cursed enough to have him as a father. I'm sure you know what happens next, or otherwise you wouldn't be here, my darling. She traces a scar on her chin that I hadn't noticed before, extending along her jaw to the start of the delicate bones of her neck. I imagine it snaking around the rest of her throat in a ring, strangling her pale skin, and my breath catches. It looks as if lightning struck her. She was struck, though not by something as rare as lightning. I instinctively touch my collarbone, where I know without looking there is a ghastly bruise. My modest neckline covers it, but somehow it feels like she knows it's there, my mark of pain. I hope it goes away quickly so my husband does not think me unsightly. But then again, perhaps that will not be necessary. I nod at her meekly to show that I do know what happens next. I can't say whether he truly meant to kill me, but to hurt me, to wound me, to make my thoughts and words disappear in flames. He meant that with all his heart. The funny thing is it was him who made my words true. Of course, he couldn't have known that I was with child. Even I did not know then. After, no one would ever get to know. I made a gravestone, although there was nothing to bury. And then a month later, I buried my poor sick husband next to it, marked only with a slab that did not bear his name, wealthy and beloved as his gold in his life. In death he became only stone. The disease had taken him so quickly that there was no time for anyone to save him. Shame on chance to take him from this world so young. Got him like poison, essentially. The porcelain around her eyes cracks faintly in amusement. I have nothing to say in response. My mind stuck on the picture of a crude gravestone smaller than it should be. Now, love, how would you like your tragedy to occur? The widows in my town all chose differently. Most agree that the worst methods are only to be used for the worst husbands. But sometimes there is no rhyme or reason to it. After all, all's fair in love and war. Millions of second and third and fourth thoughts crossed my mind on the way here. But now those voices are silent, and there is only mine and hers, and the input of the hissing wind outside. Well, what will it be? In 2 weeks it will happen, on the way home after a day of work. My husband will feel a bout of hopelessness that gives him a nudge to hurl himself off of the local bridge. The river below is not a kind one, especially to those who never learned to swim. He will have been drunk, since he often is, and everyone knows how he gets when he's drunk. No one will discuss a death as taboo as taking your own life. My children and I will cry and wear black for weeks, though no longer than what is expected. At the same time, the black of our bruises will fade. He won't be missed very much, really. Perhaps that French woman will miss him, but she would have met the man that I knew soon enough. I will decide to raise my children in the countryside alone, and we will be happy. I cannot say yet whether I will regret it. The final time I will see the woman's wild tiger's eyes. She will tell me that not once has she regretted anything in her life. She will say that it was a pleasure to do it, and fearfully I will believe her. Oh, it really is getting late, love. Your family must be at home expecting you. I reply that they are, and I thank her for her kindness, nervously reaching to shake her hand. How much blood has coated it? On the posters they say she has killed 3 men, but I know these were simply the times she wanted it enough to make it gruesome. The posters also envision her as grotesque, which means that they have not ever seen her, or the mark on her jaw from her fall after being struck by lightning. The posters know nothing. The men know nothing. We women must stick together, yes? The image of my young daughter appears and consumes my mind. I would do everything in my power to ensure she never has to know the instructions to get here. There will be no scars for my girl to trace. I will make sure of that. I gnawed and dropped the woman's unassuming porcelain hand. Beneath the sound of her wind-chimed voice is a softer noise I hadn't paid attention to before, almost like a breeze rustling through dying trees, overlaid with the humming of the earth. It is separate from the wind and the rushing of my blood. She notices my piqued interest, and rather than say anything, stands, chuckles, and regally draws back the tattered blue curtain behind her. In view now is a cage, filled with twisting and writhing scaled bodies, hissing and competing with each other for air. They move as one, a trembling monster of green. I step back in sudden horror. She isn't looking at me, but I see her eyes flash ravenously. You don't have to worry about them, darling. Their venom is reserved for the venomous. Story 7. Raindrop Reverie. The rain had always been falling, soaking the city in a cold, relentless downpour. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped out of the vehicle and looked at my surroundings. The wet pavement reflected the flashing red and blue of squad cars. A uniformed officer lifted the crime scene tape. His face was strained. "Detective Gray," he said. "Captain's already inside." I nodded, shaking off the water as I ducked under the awning of the alley. The smell of damp concrete mixed with something coppery. A forensic tech worked a camera over the body, flashes lighting up the grim scene. Maria Lenz lay in a crumpled heap, her throat slit. Blood had pooled beneath her. Her lips were tinged blue. Her skin pruned like she'd been pulled from a bathtub. But there was no water here, just the rain. I crouched beside her, careful not to disturb the scene. A slip of paper stuck to her fingers, half dissolved by the rain. I eased it from her grip, but the words were gone, washed away. She had tried to tell us something. Now it was lost. Mugging gone wrong. Captain Delacroix's voice cut through the static of the rain. He loomed over me, hands in the pockets of his trench coat. No wallet, no jewelry. Poor girl fought back, got her throat opened up. I looked up at him. Then why does she look drowned? His jaw tensed. Autopsy will tell us. I glanced at Maria's face again. The rain clung to her skin, tracing lines like tears. It felt wrong. The water wasn't just falling. It seemed to linger, as if reluctant to let go. A whisper brushed against my ear. I turned sharply, scanning the alley, but there was no one there. Just the rain running down the brick walls. Its soft murmur filling my head. "You okay, Gray?" Delacroix asked. I swallowed hard. "Fine. Just tired." "Good. Then wrap this up. We're calling it a robbery. No need to dig deeper." He walked off, leaving his words hanging in the air. No need to dig deeper. The rain whispered again, too faint to understand. Maria Lenz had a story to tell, and the rain wasn't done speaking. The city never dried. Water smothered the streets, seeped into the cracks, pooled in the spaces where light should have been. It carried voices, too muffled and distant. If I listened too long, I started to hear things that weren't there. I needed answers. At the precinct, I ran the records, searching for a pattern. Muggings cases, a body that wasn't a random victim, waterlogged corpses, always the same silence, same message. Then I found it, the rain letters, buried in old unsolved cases. Notes showing up in the hands of dead victims who had drowned despite being found dry. Someone had figured it out before, but nothing came of it. Victor Ruiz was next, a journalist whose name had come up in my search. He was the only one who had published any real investigation into these deaths. He'd been chasing the rain letters for years, but people thought he was crazy. His office was above a rundown cafe. The smell of cigarettes and regret lingered on him. He didn't offer coffee, just lit a cigarette like it was part of him. "I've been expecting you." His voice was dry. I dropped Maria Lenz's file on the desk. "You've been following this?" Ruiz leaned back, his chair creaking. "Of course. It's all connected." "What's all?" "The rain letters." He exhaled smoke. "Same note with every victim. Same strange death. They drowned, but no water." He paused. "Some of them were involved in a project called Nix." "Project Nix?" I repeated. "Won't find it in any records." The higher-ups made sure of that. "Tell me what you know," I asked. "Not much." He pushed a folder across the table. "Just the bodies. The whispers. It's tied to some government mess. Top secret stuff. People who got too close are dead or hiding. You know anyone who can help?" "You can check this guy. Call him Drifter," he replied. "He doesn't talk to me, but he might talk to you." The phone buzzed. I picked it up without thinking. "The rain is trying to tell you something," the voice said, thin and distant. "Listen, before it washes you away." The line went dead. The Drifter wasn't hard to find. He was a guy who wandered through alleyways like they were his home, mumbling to himself. The locals didn't talk to him. I didn't expect him to talk to me. I followed the lead through street informants, piecing together a trail that led to the city's slums, where the rain always seemed heavier. There, the Drifter was waiting. "You heard it, didn't you?" he rasped, staring at the rain with wide, desperate eyes. "Hear what?" I squinted at him. "The rain," he whispered. "It speaks. Listen, it will show you." I frowned, not sure whether he was about to say something useful or scream at me to leave. "I saw her," he mumbled. "A woman drowning, gasping for breath. She's next." He shuddered. eyes darting around as if the rain itself was watching. My head turned, trying to process what he meant. What woman? His lips trembled. You'll see her. If you're listening, he handed me a photo, blurry, taken in some alley. I didn't wait for more. The rain was pulling me under. I made my way through the city to find a woman, a survivor, who remembered the experiment done to her. She knew about the project and was prepared to tell me everything. The trail led to a rundown motel. Rain pounded the streets, the world feeling wrong, bending. Then it hit me, a vision. The alley twisted, the face, a woman, gasping for air, reaching for help. Her eyes looked wild. I knew that face. The photo. I knew where to find her, but I was too late. The door to the room was ajar. Inside, silence. I stepped in. Her body lay on the floor, a bullet in her chest. But it appeared she had died from drowning. Another note. The handwriting was the same as before. The same warning. I didn't need to look at the note. I knew what it said. I exited the building, and before I could make sense of anything else, the sound of a gunshot rang out. It was close. The street was eerily quiet. I ran. My breath was shallow, panic creeping in. Then it came again. The crack of a gunshot, followed by the screech of car tires. Someone wanted me off the case. Someone wanted me dead. The rain whispered louder now. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. I went to see Drifter again, pressing him for another lead. He cracked the moment I told him the woman was dead. Fear settled into his eyes. He knew he might be next. Half an hour later, a name slipped out. Gabriel Vaughn. He had been part of Project Nyx, the same project that had put me on this path to begin with. Now I knew he was the key, hiding in an old warehouse at the edge of the city, forgotten like him. With that, I turned and set my sights on the road ahead. The answers I needed were just a step away, but at what cost? I finally tracked Gabriel Vaughn down to an abandoned building. His eyes were dark and hollow, the look of someone who had seen too much and survived despite it all. A former scientist from Project Nyx, now a ghost, hiding in the ruins of his own past. Vaughn, I said, stepping into the dim light of the empty warehouse. He didn't flinch when he saw me. You shouldn't have come here. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. I'm Detective Gray and I need answers. Vaughn leaned against the cold brick wall, his hand trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. You won't like this, he mumbled. I don't care, I replied. I need to understand why this is happening. He sighed, his voice fragile. The government used water as a medium, memory storage. The idea was to trap human consciousness inside water and preserve memories. He paused, but it failed. The subjects didn't just lose themselves. They were trapped, forever reliving their worst moments. The horror, the pain, the terror. It never stopped. It just kept looping in their heads. My mind struggled to process the impossible. It was too surreal to grasp. But something deep inside me knew it was true. The rain, I whispered. The rain carries those memories. Vaughn nodded. The rain absorbs their suffering. When they die, it isn't just water that falls. It's their agony, their torment, their memories. That's why the victims, the ones who died without drowning, look like they're gasping for air, like they're still fighting for life. The rain holds them. Every victim is a piece of someone's last moments, suspended in time. It's trapped in the rain itself. This was bigger than I had imagined. My mind scrambled to piece together the implications of his words, but I barely had time to process them before Vaughn's next revelation sent a shock through me. Delacroix, he spat, his voice laced with disgust. He was the enforcer, the one sending when things went south. When the project failed and people started dying, Delacroix was the one who cleaned up the mess. And he silenced anyone who knew too much. People like me. Delacroix, the captain. My brows furrowed. Vaughn's eyes hardened. Yes, your captain is deep in it. He's the one who's been covering up the bodies, making sure no one connects the dots. He's just as dirty as the rest of them. Before I could say anything more, a sound cut through the stillness. Boots. Heavy. Fast. Getting closer. I turned, instincts flaring. It was too late. A dozen officers, uniformed and armed, stormed the building. I cursed under my breath and dove for cover as the first shots rang out. Gunfire erupted, the sound bouncing off the concrete. I returned fire as best I could, but I was outnumbered. The odds were stacked against me. Vaughn shouted something, but his voice was lost in the chaos. I moved through the shadows, barely staying ahead of the bullets. Then I saw him. Vaughn, too slow, too weak, being dragged away by two of Delacroix's men. His face was the last thing I saw before they disappeared into the night. I didn't know how long I had before they came for me next, but I had no choice. I ran. Captain Delacroix was waiting in his office, his face unreadable, but the tension in his posture told me everything. He knew I was coming. I didn't waste time. It's over, Captain. I know what you've done. He didn't flinch. He only sighed and brushed his fingers along the rim of the glass. You know nothing, Gray. I slammed the file onto his desk. Maria Lenz, the rain letters, the victims, all of them, the ones who had died without water. His expression shifted as he looked at the file. The mask slipped. I know everything, I said, my voice ice cold. You have been silencing them, killing them to stop the rain from revealing their memories, to keep the truth buried. And what do you think you're going to do with that truth, detective? Expose me? He laughed. The rain does not care about justice. It only exists to erase what is left of us. The memories, the guilt. I killed them to stop it from exposing us. I did what needed to be done. You killed them because you're guilty. You tried to bury your sins. And now the rain is making you pay for it. The rain outside picked up. It tapped harder against the windows, almost as if it were alive. Delacroix didn't seem to notice, but I did. Water had seeped through the cracks in the window, forming a small puddle on the floor that began to shimmer. I saw them, the reflections, faint at first, then clearer. Maria Lenz, writhing and gasping for air after she was killed. The woman in the motel, struggling after being shot. Their deaths were woven together with the agony of the experiment. Each crime rippled through the water's reflection. The rain whispered their stories as Delacroix talked. You see, his voice broke. You think you can save them? You think this will bring them peace? The rain is a curse, a punishment. It knows everything. It remembers everything. His face twisted in desperation. His eyes went frantic. I took a step toward him, but before I could move again, his men burst through the door. Everything happened too fast. I was surrounded. There were too many of them. They dragged me out of the office. This is your end, detective. Delacroix's parting words carried no doubt. You will be washed away just like the others. They threw me into a storm drain. The metal grates clanged shut behind me. The water rose fast. I fought to keep my head above the surface, but the current was strong. My breath shortened. The world around me narrowed. Panic clawed at my chest. I tried to focus, but the rain poured from above, It was everywhere. It pressed on, cold and suffocating. Then something changed. The rain, which had once felt like a curse, shifted. It pulled at me, not with force, but with a strange guiding tug. The water changed its flow. It swirled beneath me. It pushed me toward an opening in the wall, a crack in the drain. I kicked against the current and pulled myself toward the gap. The water was rising fast, but the rain above had stopped overwhelming me. It led me out. I emerged gasping for air, wet and freezing, but alive. Then the rain whispered again. Its voice was clearer now, insistent. This is where it ends. I staggered to my feet. A vision bloomed before me. It was not just in my mind. The rain had revealed it. Project Nix, a location, an address, the last piece. The water treatment plant was abandoned. It should have felt like a graveyard, but the hum of the old pumps and the smell of rusted pipes made it feel alive. This place had seen horrors. I could feel it in the cracked concrete beneath my boots. I called Delacroix to meet me here. I had not expected him to come so easily and alone, but he had no choice. He thought he could silence me like he had silenced everyone else. But I had the truth now, and I was not running. You know what this place is, don't you? I asked as we reached the central chamber where the floodwaters had pooled. He did not answer. He did not need to. He knew. This is where it all started, I said, stepping closer to the water's edge. The test subjects. This is where you ran the experiment. Delacroix took a step forward. His voice was low and dangerous. I am the one who controls this. I always have. I did not flinch. Not anymore. A violent rush of water swirled around us, the floodwaters inching higher with every passing second. I saw it before he did. The reflections in the water. Faces contorted in agony. All of them Delacroix's victims. The water began to carry their memories, his crimes. Their faces hovered in the ripples, blinking, staring up at him. Maria Lenz, her eyes wide with terror as she fought to breathe. The others, each one, another name on a list Delacroix had buried. The rain whispered in a language I could not understand, but I knew what it was saying. It was showing him what he had done. Delacroix staggered back, fear in his eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps. The rain had become his mirror, reflecting the sins he had tried to bury. He could no longer escape the past. No, he gasped, his voice breaking. No, I didn't. I saw it. The distraction was all I needed. I lunged forward, grabbed his arm with all my strength, and shoved him toward the surging flood. Let it take you, I said through clenched teeth. Let it consume you. The water swept around him, pulling him in, rising faster. Delacroix fought, his hands clawing at the surface, but the rain kept pushing him under, dragging him deeper into his own sins. The water churned, the past drowning him in its memory, and then it was over. He was gone. The floodwaters receded, leaving only silence in their wake. The storm began to clear. The rain slowed, then stopped altogether. I stood in the remains of the flood, my feet planted firmly in the water that had claimed him. For the first time in years, the sky was breaking open. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting long shadows across the city. It was as if the sun had not seen the world. In so long it did not know how to look. I took a step back, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of everything lifting from my shoulders. But then, a whisper. I froze. The rain was gone, but the voice remained. Camilla, my father's voice, soft and fleeting. I looked up. The rain had called me to this moment. It was not just about the murders or the conspiracy. It had been about me all along. I had been chasing ghosts. I was part of the story, the one the rain had been writing all this time. Story 8, The Cold Man. The first snowflake materialized in mid-August, drifting past the neon sign of Eddie's Bar and Grill like a lost feather. Vincent Graves watched it descend, his steel-gray eyes tracking its lazy spiral until it dissolved on the scorching pavement. His breath clouded in front of him, a physical impossibility in 90-degree heat. A woman hurried past, her sandals slapping against the concrete as she crossed Vincent's path. She wrapped her arms around herself, shuddering violently. Her pace quickened, but she never looked up, never acknowledged the man in the charcoal suit who cast no shadow on the sun-bleached sidewalk. Vincent pulled out his phone, checking the time. 3:47 p.m. The screen flickered, numbers distorting before the device went dark. Dead. He'd charged it fully before arriving, but technology had a way of failing around him lately. He'd learned to rely on the old-fashioned methods. His wristwatch, paper maps, written instructions. The fog rolled in without warning, thick tendrils of gray mist that seemed to reach for him with ghostly fingers. Streetlights sputtered to life hours before dusk, their yellow glow diffused and sickly in the unnatural haze. Ice crystals formed in delicate patterns on store windows, spreading like silver veins across the glass. Vincent's footsteps made no sound as he moved down the emptying street. Each step left a trace of frost that vanished moments later, like memories too painful to hold. The few remaining pedestrians unconsciously shifted away from his path, creating a bubble of isolation that moved with him through the growing gloom. The paper in his pocket crinkled, the only sound that seemed to emanate from this person. He withdrew it, studying the address again. 1247 Marlowe Avenue, Apartment 5B. Evelyn Gray. The name stirred something in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't quite reach. He'd done his research, as always. Single woman, lived alone, worked from home. An easy mark. But something felt different about this contract. A child's ball bounced past him, followed by a little boy who skidded to a stop 3 feet from Vincent. The boy's eyes widened, his small mouth forming an O of surprise. Unlike the adults, he stared directly at Vincent, his gaze fixed on something about Vincent's face that made his lower lip tremble. "Tommy," a mother's voice called. "Come inside right now. It's getting cold." The boy backed away slowly, then turned and ran, leaving his ball behind. It lay there on the sidewalk, collecting a thin layer of frost where Vincent's shadow should have fallen. For the first time in his career, Vincent felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name. The fog thickened around him, and in the distance, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. The apartment complex on Marlowe Avenue loomed before him, a decaying monument of brick and rusted fire escapes. Vincent's presence seemed to drain the color from the building. Red bricks faded to ash gray. Green ivy withered and blackened against the walls. The security door hung open, its electronic lock dark and silent. The lobby mirror caught his attention, or rather, the absence that caught his attention. Where his reflection should have been, there was only an odd distortion, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, except these waves carried frost instead of warmth. Vincent blinked, and for a moment, he thought he saw something else in the mirror. Blood-stained snow, a dark figure standing over him, the flash of a gun barrel. The memory slipped away like water through his fingers. The elevator doors opened at his approach, though he hadn't pressed the call button. Inside, the temperature dropped so dramatically that the metal handrail crackled with forming ice. As he ascended, the fluorescent lights flickered in sequence, creating a strobe effect that made the small space feel like a cage in motion. The digital floor display malfunctioned, showing impossible numbers before settling on a dim 5. The fifth-floor hallway stretched before him, empty except for the strange shadows that seemed to dance at the edges of his vision. Each door he passed bore signs of life. Welcome mats, decorative wreaths, the smell of cooking. But no sounds emerged from behind them. The silence was absolute, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Apartment 5B waited at the end of the hall. Vincent reached for his gun, an automatic gesture born from years of practice. But his hand froze halfway. Something was wrong. The weapon felt foreign, almost theoretical, like trying to grasp a dream upon waking. A woman's voice drifted through the door, so faint he might have imagined it. "I knew you'd come back." The words triggered another flash. Headlights in darkness. The crack of a gunshot. Evelyn Gray's face illuminated by muzzle flash. But that was impossible. He'd never met his target before. The contract had come through his usual channels. Everything professional, everything normal. Except nothing about this job felt normal. The door to 5B swung open at his touch, hinges groaning like something in pain. Arctic air rushed past him into the apartment, carrying with it the scent of old snow and buried secrets. The fog followed him in, curling around his ankles like a loyal pet, spreading across the floor in searching tendrils. In the center of the living room, a woman sat in a threadbare armchair, her silver hair catching the weak light from a single lamp. She didn't look up as Vincent entered, but a sad smile played across her lips. "You still don't remember, do you, Vincent?" Evelyn Gray's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in his mind like a shout. That night in the snow, the contract you weren't supposed to survive. The fog thickened, and somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight in the middle of the afternoon. Vincent's head throbbed with increasing intensity as fragments of memory burst behind his eyes like frozen stars. The apartment walls seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting with each flash of recollection. Ice crept up the windows in jagged patterns, sealing them in a crystalline tomb. "You were different from the others," Evelyn continued, still not meeting his gaze. Her fingers traced patterns on the armchair's fabric, leaving trails of frost in their wake. "You hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough." Another memory exploded. A manila envelope sliding across a restaurant table. Evelyn's face younger but harder, her eyes burning with determination. "Take the contract," she had said. "Make it look like a professional hit." But that wasn't right. She was his target, not his client. Wasn't she? The room temperature plummeted further. Water pipes groaned in the walls, ice expanding within them like veins carrying frozen blood. A mirror on the far wall shattered spontaneously, the crack spreading in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a bullet hole. "I was a loose end," Vincent heard himself say, the words emerging without conscious thought. His voice sounded strange, distant, as if it were traveling across a vast frozen wasteland to reach his ears. But whose? Evelyn finally looked up, and Vincent staggered back. Her eyes reflected not the room around them, but a different scene. A snow-covered parking lot, a black SUV with tinted windows. 3 men in suits watching from a distance as Vincent approached his supposed target. "Your employers needed to tie up loose ends," she said, rising from the chair. Her movements were fluid, unaffected by the cold that had turned the apartment into an Arctic chamber. "You knew too much about the organization, about the politicians they controlled. I was hired to hire you, to bring you to that parking lot." The fog swirled more violently now, and in its eddies, Vincent saw faces. Judges he'd helped blackmail, witnesses he'd eliminated, corrupt officials he'd protected. He saw the moment he'd begun to question his orders, the evidence he'd gathered in secret. He saw the decision to turn state's witness, and he saw the bullet that had ensured he never would. The contract was never on me, Evelyn said, moving closer. Frost spread from Vincent's feet across the floor, reaching for her like hungry fingers. I was the bait. You were the target. And now you're still hunting, still trying to complete a contract that never existed. Because it's the only way your spirit knows how to move through this world. The walls of the apartment began to fade, revealing the true scene behind them. A snow-covered parking lot, police tape fluttering in a winter wind, evidence markers surrounding a dark stain in the snow. The apartment dissolved completely, reality shifting like ice breaking apart on a frozen lake. Vincent stood in the exact spot where he had died, snow swirling around him in an endless loop. The parking lot was both empty and full, empty in the present, but overlaid with echoes of that fatal night. He watched his own murder play out like a grainy film. The approach, the conversation, the sudden movement, the flash. 3 months, Evelyn said, her form flickering between past and present, young and old, solid and transparent. 3 months you've been wandering the city, bringing winter to summer, seeking a target that never was. The cold isn't following you, Vincent. You are the cold. You're what happens when a violent death meets an unfinished purpose. Vincent looked down at his hands. Frost covered them like a second skin, and through his palms, he could see the pavement below. The gun he'd been reaching for earlier had never been there. Just a phantom memory, like everything else about him. Why, help me understand now, he asked, his voice carrying the hollow sound of wind through empty buildings. Why not let me continue searching? Evelyn's expression softened. Because I've carried this guilt for 3 months. Because you weren't the only one who wanted to expose them. I've spent every day since then gathering evidence, finishing what you started. Tomorrow morning, it all comes out. The organization, the murders, the corruption, everything. The snow falling around them began to slow. Individual flakes suspending in the air like stars in a private universe. Vincent felt a pull, subtle but insistent, like a tide drawing him toward some distant shore. The cold can stop now, Evelyn whispered. You can stop. Vincent looked at the spot where his blood had stained the snow. The evidence marker was number 13, an unlucky number for an unlucky man. But as he watched, the marker faded, and in its place, a single flower pushed through the frost, its petals unfurling in defiance of the perpetual winter he had created. They'll come for you, he said, feeling himself growing fainter, the edges of his being softening like ice returning to water. Evelyn smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the woman who had sat across from him in that restaurant, full of fire and determination. Let them come. Some things are worth dying for. You taught me that. The parking lot grew dimmer, the snow slower, the cold less intense. Vincent felt warm for the first time since the bullet had torn through him. As his consciousness began to dissolve, he saw one final scene play out. Evelyn walking away from his body, clutching a USB drive that had fallen from his pocket, determination replacing grief on her face. He had never failed a contract in life. But perhaps, he thought as the last of him faded away, this failure had been his greatest success. The snow stopped, the cold lifted, and somewhere in the city, summer returned.